Welcome to Reconnect, the podcast dedicated to sharing and defending the good news of Jesus Christ. That is, Jesus died for sins, was buried, and on the third day was raised again according to the Scriptures for our salvation. It is through Jesus alone that we are reconnected into a right relationship with God. Reconnect us, O Lord. Hey, this is Andy Rasman. Welcome to another episode of Reconnect. This is episode 82. This is a follow-up to episode 76 with Jonathan Pratt, who presented his Hymn Cruncher. I guess that's still in a name from a different podcast. But it was a list of criteria for considering what songs should be sung in worship. I really liked that list that he put together, and he said he really got into thinking about this list because he was wanting to select songs that would be appropriate to sing with his children, to teach the faith to his children. And if these songs are good in his household, hopefully they're the ones that would be sung in church. And if we're singing the same songs in the home as we would in church, he said it would be easier then for his kids to get involved at this very young age in the church service. And he kind of dropped this kind of heavy-handed quip with words. That is if your church allows kids in church. And I know a lot of churches don't have children in church. If you're like 5 or under, you're void from the service. That just doesn't exist. And John passed this off to David Rueter at Concordia University Irvine, who listened to that episode and said he would actually like to talk on that a little bit. So I have David Rueter here and Jonathan Pratt. They're going to talk about the episode that they wanted to have, and I hope to learn from them on it. Just so you know a little bit about David, since it's his first time on this podcast. He is the director of
I'm director of the DCE program.
Director of the director of Christian.
Right. That's a little convoluted, right?
That's amazing.
I'm the director of directors. I don't know. How do you want to put that? But yeah.
Very cool. So what is a DCE? Just so for people who aren't Lutheran listening, it's not a term in the Bible that I know of.
Yeah, no, it isn't. Director of Christian Education, DCE, focuses on basically the Christian education that happens within the context of a congregation. So oftentimes they'll be hands-on with youth ministry, children's ministry, family ministry, handle adult education programming, vacation Bible school, mission trips. You can start get the impression it can be kind of a sizable laundry list of activities and work. In a sense, it's a way of assisting the ministry of the pastor by focusing either on a piece of that or holistically on the Christian education that's taking place within the congregation.
Right, and you just said how that education can be specific to certain generational
Sure, no, absolutely.
So that certainly fits for what we're going to be talking about now.
Yeah, I mean, there are DCEs that are very specific in the sense that they serve in one aspect of youth ministry. There are some in larger congregations that it's a focus on, they just do high school youth group, or they just do youth ministry for junior high. Some are very focused on children's ministry. I would say the majority are more generalist in the sense that it's kind of cradle to grave is kind of terminology, or lifespan, as we often term it at Concordia Irvine, where we talk in terms of holistically looking at Christian education and trying to impart that as a way of doing ministry within a congregation, and looking at how do we teach and convey the faith from one generation to the next.
Wow, that's awesome. And with that, you do have a book called Teaching the Faith at Home.
Yes.
What does this mean? How is this done? Again, listener, that is Teaching the Faith at Home. What does this mean? How is this done? It's by David Rueter. And it's a CPH book, which is Concordia Publishing House. It's the publishing arm of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the denomination that we're all a part of. And I'll have a link to it on this episode's blog post at andyrasman.com. Again, it's andyrasman.com. This is episode 82. Okay, so let's dig on in then, since we have a little introduction of what we're going to be doing. Jonathan, I thought a good jumping off point on this was an article you posted to Facebook recently. The article was entitled 4 Reasons It Is Good Your Children Are Being Too Loud in Church. And without clicking on it, I knew It was going to be linked to what we're talking about now. I shared this, and one person said that the title was very confusing and misleading. And I go, what do you mean? She didn't have the subtext that, there's a debate brewing about should children be in church or not. I guess one reason is maybe they are too loud, maybe they are too noisy. So let's get them out so we're not distracted by the little children. But this article is saying, hey, if your child is in the service and is too loud, that's a good thing. Why did you share this article on your blog post or on your Facebook wall?
So when I first came across the article, obviously the title caught my attention as it did yours and probably everybody else that came across it for a number of reasons. One, the idea of characterizing whether it's a good idea or a bad idea for a child to be in a church service in general is just a basic question that needs to be answered. And then the why of that. Why would it be better for them not to be in there? Why is it better for them to be in there? Then in the title, it also characterizes the child as being, quote, too loud in church. And of course, it's supposed to catch your attention and draw you into the article. Anna Mussmann? I'm going to go ahead and go with Mussmann. Has a background with Concordia University in Mequon, Wisconsin. And she gets to 4 points. And Andy, do you mind if I go through these really quick?
No, I was hoping you would.
So the first one is succinct, you are here. And the idea just being, hey, kids are loud. Kids in general tend to be loud. But hey, you are here in church, hopefully as an adult participating, hopefully as an adult hearing God's word, hopefully as an adult setting the example, which she gets to later in the article. And just, I'm going to use the word, experiencing the divine service, experiencing God giving his gifts to us, his word and his sacrament. So checking off point number 1, you are in church. I think that's a great starting point. Well, I think she does a good job starting there.
Yeah, no, I think it's really the right place to some degree to start with this because if you, I'm assuming she implies the you, it's you as the parent. You're there, so why wouldn't your kids be there? Now, obviously, she leads in with the why up front in the sense of your kids are loud, and I got 2 boys, an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. They know what loud is. I was assisting in worship as an elder at our church this last Sunday, and from the back of the church, I could hear my 5-year-old objecting to something up in the front. Now, first of all, there's actually a strategic reason.
You put him in the front?
We put him in the front,
okay.
And there's a rationale for that. We like to have our kids in the front because if they can actually see and engage in worship, they're more likely to pay attention to what's going on.
Okay.
You have a 5-year-old who sits and stares at the back of the heads of people, you're actually going to have them be more distracted. So I would rather have them be up front where they can engage. And occasionally, my sons have actually will answer rhetorical questions that appear in sermons, which demonstrates they are paying attention. They may not fully comprehend what it is they're responding to, or you get that humorous, possibly inappropriate laugh where they're catching something that those of us who are over 30 and over 40 who are kind of going, I don't know why that was funny, but the 6-year-old thought it was hysterical. I think that's a good thing. But from a research standpoint, this is where I want to drill home on this a little bit. Some of you maybe, I don't know if you're familiar with Christian Smith. Did research a few years ago, the National Study of Youth and Religion. Major nationwide study was done, I believe, in 3 phases over, I think, close to 10 years worth of research data. And looking at the religious landscape, and to some degree looking at the comparison between what's happening in the faith life of parents and how that compares with the faith life in their kids. Yeah. And one of the things that shows up in the research is that there is a solid reflection. Okay, so not just in the belief system that parents have in what shows up in their kids, which is one of those slap yourself in the forehead kind of duh moments. Well, that makes great sense, but it's also there's a correlation between the way in which your children see you practice your faith in how they function in the faith. So he brings in this concept that gets bandied around a bit, moralistic therapeutic deism. The idea that...
That was one of our conversation starters at UCI before we landed on contradict.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those, it's buzzwordy kind of whatever, but the rationale behind it is are we teaching the faith in such a way that future generations are picking up a moralistic version of it that makes them feel good? And it's deistic in the sense that God is not on top. He's not really involved. He's not invested. So classical deism talks in terms of, God has created the world and he's turned it loose and good luck, have fun. And it's therapeutic in the sense that he wants you to feel good. Well, is that really what religion is all about? So, I mean, so those of us who are of much more orthodox faith get a little uncomfortable with the idea that that's what we would be passing on to our kids. So we're curious. Well, why would that be? Well, part of the issue is if our kids are not seeing us actually participating in the faith, they're only able to emulate what they see. Okay, right. So if they don't see mom and dad worshiping, they know they go and do it. I mean, that's beneficial in and of itself. But if they're not seeing you actually do it, they're less likely to actually bother to do it when they have the choice to later.
Yeah, for sure. And when you talked about seeing mom and dad do it, obviously everyone's probably had a different church experience in terms of what happens on Sundays.
Sure.
But I certainly have been to a church, was a member of a church where there was a Sunday school time that had a service running at the same time, and there was a high school Sunday school at that time.
Yeah.
But there was, in the adult Sunday school, might have existed, might not have existed, but I did make it to one of those once, and there was like 4 people on it. So the bulk of the adults were going to that service at the time. But that high school, they actually called it the high school service.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Even though it was the, quote, Sunday school time. So it's almost like it's Sunday school until you got to about high school, and then all of a sudden that became a service. So these kids literally weren't in church with their parents. Yeah. What I did find interesting, though, as well, is that some of those high school students didn't have parents that went to that church.
Yeah. Right.
And I don't even know if they did go to church at all, because these were kids that went to Christian education their entire life. For whatever reason, their parents sent them to private Christian schools. And, they probably were still there because it was the elementary, middle school that they went to.
Sure.
And then when they went to the high school Christian private school, well, they kept going to this church willfully on their own, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I've seen that firsthand in multiple congregations where there's a relational connection, and often that's really what keeps a teenager connected to the life of the church is what kind of a relational connection do they have with it. One of the things that's important to keep in mind is, as I'm going to push and I'm going to be really strong and hopefully not obnoxious about this. I'm very much in favor of kids in worship. I mean, like hugely. But I understand the parent who's uncomfortable with that.
Right.
Okay. I understand the parent who says, well, I don't know that I'm going to get a lot out of the sermon with my kid crawling all over me. I'm sympathetic. My youngest is he's a lot to work with. He is in constant motion, and it takes a lot to kind of keep him occupied. And I sort of get that. I mean, I understand the uncomfortableness. But this is actually one of the reasons why I try to be as obvious as I can that I have my kids in church, and I try to encourage other families it's like if you're uncomfortable with that, actually come and sit with us.
Oh yeah.
Let's put the not to quarantine the chaos, but let's put it in somewhat of an area together so I can help. Yeah, in the front. Yeah, so I can actually if I want to help to encourage you, I want to help you to feel comfortable with this, and I can understand from somebody the perspective of a parent who's maybe new to the faith, even being really uncomfortable with the idea and going, I'm trying to understand what it means to be a Christian, and little Timmy is crawling all over the place, and I can't really pay attention. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can sympathize that, but if it's important, here's the thing: is if it's important to you to learn about the Christian faith, I think it's greatly important for your child to learn about the Christian faith as well. Right. And the research does keep coming back to this thing that your kids they pick up more than you think they do. Mm-hmm. They will emulate the behaviors that they see you do. It's a wonderful thing for me to look and see my kids standing next to me, and they're bowing their heads when it's time to pray, and I don't have to tell them to do it. They're standing when they need to stand some of the time. They're tracking. They're learning more than you anticipate.
Right. And then in addition to them learning the faith, they're emulating seeing you in worship. Anna Mussmann listed 3 other reasons for why it's good to have this scenario you just described of your kids making a lot of noises and crawling over the pews. Jonathan, you might keep going on those? What were some of her other reasons for why it would be beneficial to the whole of the body of Christ there, not just the kids for being there?
Yeah, she mentions it's a witness to your own children, but then it's also a witness to the people around you. I can't imagine what it looks like as an outsider, but for somebody to see my wife and me pulling our kids or pushing our kids or carrying our kids into the sanctuary continually about 6 minutes late every single Sunday. In fact, I think our pastors should move confession and absolution to the end of the service just so we have the opportunity to do confession and absolution because we miss it just about every single week.
I didn't even know our service added confession and absolution because I'm always late. It wasn't there for a while, but it's been added.
Well, possibly the bad joke might be is, especially if you're bringing your kids to worship, maybe we need to have it at the beginning and the end just in case, to cover what happens in between. But it
could be like our
or the car ride too. Right?
Yeah,
it could be like our altar call post sermon.
Oh yeah, let's go there. Yeah, let's do that.
There we go. So she goes on to say that when you discipline your toddler multiple times in the narthex, whether or not you're having to do that before you even get into the church or you have to pull them out, you're demonstrating your interest. You're demonstrating that it's hard work. You're demonstrating also, and she gets into this later, I think. You're demonstrating also that you're being consistent as a parent, and when God tells us to be fathers and mothers and children to honor your father and your mother, we understand that that's also extrapolated into God is our Father, and He relates to us like a father relates to his children, and He's consistent with us, and so we're actually fulfilling our parental duties when we are consistent with our kids, when we consistently show up, when we consistently want them to be with us. And Dave, I love the idea of having the kids in the front row. I tried that for a long time. And then I realized getting to the front row 6 minutes late to each service is a little bit of a challenge. But it's as a music teacher, I see the obvious connection here. A kid who sits in the back row of the mezzanine in a theater is going to have a really hard time catching the nuances of what's going on stage. But if you're in the front row watching a musical, you're going to be watching the shoes of the dancer, the face, the outfits, so much more intently. You're going to see that the robe of the pastor is gleaming white. You're going to see that his collar pokes through so that you can see that he's proclaiming the word of God. You're going to see that the cross is front and center, hopefully. You're going to see those things, and a child sitting in the front row, you're right, they have no heads that they have to kind of look between or look over or past. It's all right there in front of them. It's like sitting in the front row of a movie theater. You might have to turn your head to see the whole picture, but it is right in front of you. And I think that's a fantastic witness, whether you make it to the front row or not. Anything else on the second point there? It's pretty succinct in her article. It's pretty to the point. But it's a good witness, and you're communicating, like she says, a good reminder to your children and to the other people in church with you there.
Well, connecting with the other people in church, one of the things that is of great benefit to young people growing up in the church is their connection to other people. Okay. Fuller Seminary, the Fuller Youth Institute, they've done research they call their sticky faith research, and one of the things that they point out in that is that one of the components to helping a young person stick with their connection to a local congregation is having, at minimum, they benchmark it in their research at 5 other adults, not including kind of the paid staff and your parents, but 5 other adults within the congregation that know your kids by name, that are able to have an engaging conversation with them. They don't know everything about them, but they're aware of who they are. There's a comfort level there. I love the senior citizens who know who my kids are and are paying attention to who they are and want to have a conversation with them. I want that for them, because that, not just because it looks nice and they give me nice, wonderful, affirming things and comments about, they're reminded of their own kids in worship and they're remembering how it was, and they're offering their comments. But it's also because, my kids are going to, at some point, have a question that they're going to want to bring to somebody, and it may not be me. So having that resource, having that network of people within a congregation, so that when they see them on a Sunday morning, that there's a reason why I'm there. There's a community formed, and your kids ought to be a part of that community. And so this is a good reminder. I think there's a healthiness to a certain amount of kid noise within a congregation. Because it tells you there's a vibrancy, there's a aliveness to that next generation who is trying in their own way to understand who this person Jesus is and get their heads around it. And even preschoolers, they like I said before, they catch more than you think. Right. It was an interesting observation that my wife was telling me that our Sunday school teacher, I believe, was commenting that our youngest, our 5-year-old, Wes, finishes a lot of the Bible stories for the teacher, because we have so much, we've taught him so much, and we read the Bible to him so often that he's jumping in and going, "Oh, I know how this story ends." They catch a ton. And so, seeing that lived out within the life of the congregation, in my mind, this is nothing but a positive.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier about it's surprising what the kids catch on to, and then what they spit out in the middle of worship. There was a sermon a few weeks ago where the pastor said, "Now, who is this Jesus?" And I think he was 2-year-old at the time, my son Nathan, shouts out from probably the back corner of the entire church, "God!" And I thought, my kid gets the Trinity.
Yep.
Fantastic.
Yep.
I mean, he picks it up. Exactly. You're right. You never know what is going to stick. And just maybe if he's sitting in the room when I'm talking it over with my daughter, who knows what he's going to catch on to. And teaching it at home and then having them see that in church is so incredibly valuable.
Yeah, it's probably a happy moment for everyone in the congregation, I would imagine, too.
There was some chuckling, and
one that they'll remember for a long time, I imagine.
Yeah.
That was one outburst that I did not shush.
Yeah.
Because how could you?
Yeah.
I mean, the guy's professing the deity of Christ. Fantastic.
The pastor asked.
You ask a question, you're going to get a 2 or 3-year-old to answer it for you.
Which is part of that opportunity to teach and train, which was her third point, right?
Yeah.
Teaching and training. But what was her take on the teaching and training? Was it what we've already talked about in terms of them emulating what they see from the adults, or was there more to it than that?
So she pointed out initially that she says our modern world loves self-expression, which there is something to that God makes us unique and God makes us special and different, and we each have different gifts. But then she immediately pulls that back in and says, on the other hand, it's true that as human beings, we need to learn self-control and consideration for others. And I think those two points need to be held in tension. Not that we are only and ever silent and non-feeling and no emotions allowed, no sensations allowed in church, because I don't think that's how God makes us. However, we learn in respect, and we learn in reverence, and we learn in awe of the holy God. And so she talks about how it's okay to have children being loud and fidgeting and moving. And yet there needs to be this tension where we're also teaching them to be able to sit from time to time at certain moments. I don't know about you, Dave. You were mentioning your kids standing at the right times and sitting at the right times.
Some of the time.
My goal, some of the times. Trying at least, right?
Every once in a while it takes a little, poke in the back to get it moving.
Yeah.
But
I set the standard for my kids to always sit with the congregation. I almost said audience. I don't know why I said that. Always sit with the congregation and always stand with the congregation. And if they can make it to the beginning of the sermon, then they can have their coloring book. And now I've got a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. And the 6-year-old, you can tell she's tuned in. But if my 3-year-old can make it to the beginning of the sermon,
that's a victory.
I want to stand up and shout an amen, just because I think that's a huge stretch. Yeah. It's a huge challenge. But if he can do that and now start self-regulating it and holding it and maintaining that self-control and considering those around him and being part of what he can be a part of, then I think that's great.
Yeah. On you used the word self-control a good bit because she did, but I posted this article on Facebook and said, hey, we're recording a discussion on this. What comments do you have to share? One of the guys said that currently our church has a special children's ministry where we drop the kids off at a class to learn about God in age-appropriate lessons. However, to the author of the article's point, my kids have little concept of reverence. This is much more apparent on the rare occasion that they do stay with us or have to participate in a wedding or funeral service. There is something about learning to sit quietly that teaches them something more about God that is lost. I, too, have a problem with reverence, not out of ill intentions, but often the tone of my prayers and attitude are too casual. I see no issue of children learning this reverence as long as it is actually being learned and not ignored. What are your thoughts on that as a thing, reverence, and is that something that has been lost? Is that something that somehow this service can give that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be received?
That's a really interesting reflection.
Yeah, the interesting challenge to this is also that many adults have lost this as well. It's not just a matter. I'm not going to pin it on the kids. I'm going to say, watch services on occasion. An adult who's not been socialized in understanding what is the expected behavior within a service comes to watch their kids who are a part of the preschool or the day school, and they're coming to watch their kids sing, and the parents are all over the place, and it looks like you're in a movie theater instead of a worship service, But I could pass judgment on that, except, well, they don't know.
Yeah.
How am I going to understand? If I enter into an Islamic mosque, I don't know what is expected of me. Okay. So if we're going to ask children to learn these things, we have to work with and help socialize them and move them toward that. I keep coming back to that word socializing. There's a reason behind this. But I think there is a respect across generations that is missed if we don't find places in which the generations are intentionally a part of an experience together. And I would suggest that this happens. This has an impact not just on kids, teenagers, whatnot, as they're growing up. I think it has an impact on the adults. Right. So if adults are not used to being near children, they lose the appreciation and understanding of how to interact with them.
Right.
Especially if they themselves if they've not had their own kids. I worked with a pastor once several years ago. His wife had a daughter from a previous marriage, and so he then marries her when the daughter is, I think, maybe in middle school, something like that. I may not be remembering that precisely, but so he missed out on raising a young child. it was evident in the way he interacted with the kids in our preschool that he himself did not have the most natural comfort level and was really trying to, he's a really bright guy, which actually was to his detriment in that sense because he was not able to bring his intellect down to the point of having a conversation with small kids. That was a challenge for him. And so I, as the DCE, get to coach this veteran pastor on, well, how do you relate to kids and how do you help them engage? But I think there's a healthiness to that interaction where the senior citizen is able to interact with the 6-year-old, and you're able to have the conversation with a 6-year-old to say, when you're running around crazy, as 6-year-olds are wont to do because they have more energy than any of us could even hope to imagine. They're going to want around. They're going to be running all over the place, and you have to have the conversation with them some of the time to say, what would happen if Mr. Johnson over here, you see he's walking with a walker. Yeah. What would happen if you ran into him? Okay, so that helps the kid developmentally. It will help the kid also to be able to process and to think in terms of, okay, what's beyond me? Yeah. Now, the 6-year-old is not really good at this because developmentally they're not there yet. They don't understand what this means yet. But the fact that they don't understand does not mean you don't present that to them. I had an experience a few years ago with a friend of mine who had been a DCE within the Lutheran Church and had a negative experience, unfortunately, and is no longer serving in ministry. He is a faithful Christian going to a non-denominational church, and we went to service with them because we were on vacation where they now live, and they have they had their kids, and it's we're going to various buildings around this enormous facility, and it's like some of the kids go over to this building here, and then the high school building over here, and then the adults are going over here. Yeah. There was no commonality. Nothing that was taught that Sunday morning there was no common language for us to come back together and share the experience of what we learned. Yeah. It wasn't there. So we're coming back to we're leaving in the car, and there's nothing to talk about.
There's no common topic.
No. There is no. I mean, there are. I think Group attempted a curriculum a number of years ago called Faith
donuts?
Weaver. I'm not even sure that I can remember if they were donuts or not. Which we can question whether it was a church at that point. But that's totally unfair of me. But Group Publishing did have a curriculum that attempted to overcome this, but having a common curriculum does not overcome having a literal common, I've heard the same message. Yeah. We've sung the same songs together. John, you're going to agree with me on this. I'm certain of this. Kids are going to glean a lot out of the songs.
Oh man!
And the selection and the theology they're going to pick up, and their understanding of who Christ is and what He's done for us is going to show up in the things that they sing far sooner than they're going to catch on to what's happening in a sermon.
Absolutely. In fact, the same 3-year-old I was just talking about, he went through the entire week a couple weeks ago singing "Amen, Amen, Amen," the final Amen in divine service. I think it's 3, and when we got to that point of the service, I said, "Okay, Nathan, here we go," and I pointed to it, and he followed along, and we sang it together. And if he gets nothing else, he knows that we sing Amen 3 times in honor of the Trinity, and we sing it, we do it together, we're standing up for it, and it's something that our family unites in doing. Right. And I can't imagine that would take place if he was in a children's service and his older sister was in a different service and parents were in a different service. Right. It seems to me like also if they have different locations for each of the, quote, services, they probably, unless it's done very well, they probably, like you said, won't be hearing the same message. They probably won't be hearing the same readings. They won't experience the liturgy in any significant way, and they won't be looking at the church lectionary either. So the kind of yearly map of the church year and how the church progresses from reading to reading, they won't be experiencing that, and so they're going to miss some really rich continuity from, we just had it, Advent to Christmas, Christmas to Epiphany. they're going to miss out on that by being separated.
Well, and even if let's say we grant the idea that a church still manages to use the same theme, the same texts, and so the high school service is using the same text, the same theme, the junior high service is doing the same, something for the elementary kids, they're using the same theme. There's still going to be a difference in that experience and that form of worship than worshiping together as a family, because there's in the midst of your kid is going to have a question. They will know by the fact that they're in the same place with you that I have the question, hey, Dad, what does that mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to talk about an ideal moment. Now, that's also a moment, and I've pointed this out in presentations at times. Asking Dad a question is sometimes nerve-wracking for some dads.
Good.
Which is a good thing. But I want it. But and it's my encouragement. And I'm going to say to any of your listeners who happen to be church leaders or pastors, especially, when you want to encourage this taking place, be ready to be a support to mom and dad, so that when they get, not if, when, because the ideal is you want your kids asking questions. You want them to be challenged by what's going on in the service. And if they have questions, and when they have the questions, to be able to come to mom and dad and say, hey, what does this part of the service mean? And for dad to be able to say, I'm not really sure.
Let's find out together.
Yes.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah.
And that's the appropriate response. And to be able to say to a parent, and when you're talking to a parent who is new to the faith, I'll throw this on dads because we're in a room full of them here. I don't know about you. I tend to like to want to look good in front of my kids. I like to. Maybe it's the fact that they know that I am a PhD, and they actually, my dad wrote a book, and my dad's a doctor, and he knows a lot of stuff. Yeah. And yet I want them on a regular basis to know Dad doesn't know everything. Mm-hmm. And when I don't know something, I want it to be important enough and to treat it as important enough that I'm going to go find out what it is. Mm-hmm. And I want them to, if possible, I want them to come along with me so that they can be a part of the exploration process to learn about this.
Yeah. And ignorance is not necessarily the same thing as sin, but her point 4 was that you are faced with a vivid reminder of sin and grace when children are there.
Yes.
Because when you see the kids who are being unruly, who you tell them to be quiet and they intentionally then talk, or hey, don't kick that pew, and they kick the pew, and like I said, don't kick the pew, and they kick the pew again. It's this reminder that of grace, and hopefully it reminds us of our own sinfulness, and how we are God's children, and we constantly are going astray, constantly needing to be brought back to the fold, constantly needing to hear both law and gospel.
Yes. Yeah.
On that, I just heard about this a couple months ago, and somebody broke it down. I don't recall exactly where I heard it. Was as a teacher, our students experience a whole bunch of law all day long. And if I were to map out the life of my children on a Sunday morning, if they wake up early, is it law or gospel that they have to stay in bed until mom and dad are up? Well, that's law. Is it law or gospel that they have to go get dressed right now? Okay, is it law or gospel that they have to eat breakfast and brush their teeth and comb their hair? That's all law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And again, if the church happens to do a spectacular job of having, quote, kids church, you got to realize that is the first time probably that they've heard the gospel all morning. I don't mean just gospel in the Jesus sense. Yeah. I mean, that's probably the first time they've heard any good news at all.
Right.
Because their whole morning has been get in the car, get out of the car, don't kick your brother. Yeah. You put your feet down. Don't kick the pew in front of you.
And even saying, if you make it till this point, then you get the coloring book. If you make it to this point, you then get the donut. That's still law, even though it's good news, because it's conditional. If you made it this far, right? So,
and there's a whole argument that some people might say, why do you bring Cheerios into the church service? Didn't your kid eat breakfast? Why do you bring colored pencils into the church service? Can't your kid not color for an hour and a half, hour 10 minutes? Now, we bring books. We realize that they are young kids, and we realize, Dave, like you said, they're going to pick up a whole bunch of stuff. Now, if it's a distraction to others,
sure,
those things immediately disappear. But I see value in simply just acknowledging this is a hard thing for you to sit still, and showing them and giving them that grace to widen the hedges just a bit and give them a wider space to exist for just 30 minutes, the second half of the service or whatever it might be. If you can give them the grace of that moment where they don't feel, oh, I've got to lock it up, I can't move, I can't even turn my head kind of thing. Oh, I've got to... No, it's okay to move your arm and color for a few minutes. Enjoy some color. I think that grace goes a long way to showing the grace that we receive from our Heavenly Father because they're receiving it from their earthly moms and dads. I think that goes a long way to speaking to that. There's an article that, Andy, I think was referenced on your page by one of your followers, and it's went to say, if a family wants to worship together as a family, babies included, let them do it. Mm-hmm. And it goes on, however, if a couple prefers to put their baby in the care of a qualified nursery work, perhaps you should provide that too. And I would pose a question, and this is probably a tough topic. If a church provides a, quote, qualified nursery for parents to utilize for their youngest kids or maybe their middle-aged kids, whatever it might be, is the church doing a disservice? Are they stating that it's okay for your kid not to be in church for you? Or are they meeting the needs of maybe that kid's just having a really cranky morning? Maybe that year-old is teething and there is no fixing it, and it's okay that the mom can go have an hour 10 without the baby there gnawing at her necklace. Is that a bad witness on the church's part, or is that a thing where it's okay for the church to provide that type of service? What do you think?
I think if it's done in good intent, I mean, it sounds awkward to say it that way, maybe. I think providing for that is probably a must. But the way in which you communicate, if you communicate, okay, so your kid gets a little noisy, and I actually had somebody commenting to me about this just today, how they had the experience where their baby gets just a little bit fussy, and there's an immediate response of, well, there's a nursery,
right? Yeah,
and there's nothing. It's the delivery that's the issue. Making someone aware of that. Great. Making them feel uncomfortable that they need to move their kid along to that because it's disrupting you, not so much. Making someone feel uncomfortable that they made that choice, I think is also an issue. Even as much as I'm a big fan of having kids in worship, I am not going to deride someone who just is not comfortable and ready for it yet. Yeah. Again, thinking in terms of the person who they themselves are less comfortable with being in worship. So, I go back multiple generations in Lutheranism. I can show up to a Lutheran church. I get what's happening, even if I've never been to that particular place. That's comfortable for me. Someone who is yet to understand, who is really grappling with, well, what does this faith even mean? They may not be totally comfortable with that yet. And I think I don't see an issue with how the church does it, but it's how do you communicate that? How do you emphasize that your kids are welcome? And in fact, we want to encourage you to bring them in worship and have them present. But at the same time, if it is a real struggle for you, and if it is a difficulty, and if you'd have a preference, we do have that option. I mean, it's applying the grace to the parents as well. We want to understand where they're at and what they have a need for, and try to encourage and help them move toward what I might think is a more mature approach. but everybody doesn't come in at the same place, and they don't have the same initial attitude based on their own life experience. Going in a slightly different direction for a second, something you were making, John, that you were making me think of a little bit earlier, as an example, thinking about where your kids are at, where they're at developmentally, and how they function within a church service is going to be a little bit different depending from child to child. Okay, so one kid is going to be able to sit more. My older child, not just simply because he's older, but because of his personality, he much more quickly sits, listens, pays attention. He's not as physical. He's a verbal child, so he's going to engage that way, where his brother's going to be interacting more physically. I had an experience with a congregation that I served a number of years ago where we got for like the kids' kits or whatever for in worship, and we actually got Etch-a-Sketches as a way so that we didn't end up with like crayons everywhere, but it can still create things. One of my high schoolers started using those in worship, and it was some people were kind of questioning. It's like, well, why is he playing with this? Well, if you understood who he was, which is the good thing thankfully I did, he has he has ADHD, and his ability to pay attention to one thing at a time doesn't exist. He is actually better at learning when he has a secondary thing to distract him slightly. He was doing interpretation. He was doing pictorial interpretations of the sermon on the Etch-a-Sketch. I actually have one of them that he broke and framed in my office, where he does an interpretation of Pentecost. It's some of the most remarkable stuff, but it's finding, and as a church, how do you adjust to the individual? How do you prepare for them? How do you prepare for the individual family? And to be able to kind of roll with it where there isn't a one-size-fits-all, here's what we're going to do.
Well, at our church, David and I go to the same church. We do have 3 services. Sunday school is the same time as the middle service. That's when the nursery would be. And the nursery is also during the third service, maybe even the first service for all I know. I don't know.
No.
I think it's the second and third. But we've been putting our daughter in there. We usually try to keep her until about the sermon, and then we put her in there. And we for a while, we're trying to keep her through. But when she's 6 months old, she's losing it. She was, to get her to fall asleep. She doesn't nap. That's one thing. She really doesn't.
Oh, you poor guy.
When we were young, like when she was like the one, like born to about 6 months, I would have her on my chest in like an ergo walking around for at least 3 or 4 hours a day. Those are the only times she would take naps, was when she was on you. And it's still close to that way, even though that she's 2. The only time I've seen her actually intentionally fall asleep is when I'm carrying her on a long walk. It's the only time. Yeah. And so for her I don't think, and she was really fussy, but she quit getting fussy once she could crawl and once she could walk, because, I just realized she just wanted, I don't like looking at this same wall. And so that's probably why she was chill when we went for long walks together. So I could see like kind of that struggle. I don't think she would be getting too much out of it at 6 months, a year, maybe even 2 years. I don't know what she'd be getting out of the sermon as much per se. Love that your son shouted out that. I think my daughter could probably be there pretty soon. But for now, we've been putting her in the nursery. And that's something I was thinking, like, I already probably maybe got your opinion, but what about keeping her in there till about 5? I know at 3 years old, there's a Sunday school that would be for her.
Sure.
Keep her in there till about 5, and then move her into the service. I mean, would that be?
I think to some degree it's an individual judgment call on the part of the parent. I would err on the side of doing it earlier than that, but at the same time, it may be the kind of a thing where you say, I want her in there up until the point of the sermon. I think it's a good strategy. I mean, some of the churches that will do kind of a kids' church type thing where they have the kids are in worship up till the point of just prior to the sermon. That's not a half bad strategy. The downside is you want to limit the age level there to some degree, because one of the things that I found when a congregation I served had. It was the most monstrosity of a Sunday morning. It was something else. At one point, we had 6 services over 4 worship hours. And so 2 of the services took place. There were actually 2 services at a time were taking place in 2 different chapels on the campus. over 2 of those worship hours, and then we also had Sunday school at the same time as both of those.
Mm-hmm.
And what ended up happening is the culture was created where there was no expectation for kids to be in worship. So by the time they were entering into confirmation, I'm asking them as their catechist to turn in sermon reports, and they've never heard but a handful of sermons. They don't know how to learn from it. So I think there's a point at which, even if you're going to do that, probably about 3rd, 4th grade, you're going to want to, get at least some regular transition where they're hearing a sermon so that they can start tracking and learning from that. Because I'm going to say it's a skill, not just to preach a sermon. It's a skill to learn from a sermon, and it's not the kind of – we don't learn that way. We don't learn from oration the way we used to. So culturally – we're just, our kids are not prepared for this. They're learning in snippets and tiny bites, so they're not really ready. But, I would, again, it's a parental thought, and it's getting to the point of saying, okay, at what point and how much of the sermon, because in the big picture is you want your daughter to have a positive experience.
Right.
And as much as possible, avoid stigmatizing church as a negative thing.
Yeah.
But maintaining it is an important thing. Yeah. So when I hear parents talking in terms of, well, I don't want to force my kids to do it. I don't want to indoctrinate them, or I don't want to. Thank you for rolling your eyes, because you're right, John. You wouldn't do the same thing with math skills.
Right.
I don't want to indoctrinate my child into arithmetic. Well, yeah, you do. If it's important, if it's true, as if the faith means something because it corresponds to reality, that there is an actual God out there, it is important that we teach our kids how to interact with. And worship is a primary way in which we interact with the creator of the universe. So that is important for them to learn how to do so. We want to make it positive, but we want them engaged in it.
Two things to your point, Andy. The idea that the youngest of kids can listen to a sermon, or at least have it kind of, I guess, in the background and experience something out of it. That's where I always will point to music. That's where I'll point to hymnody, because when music is such a powerful way to learn text, to learn words. And even if you don't understand the meaning of it, you're going to catch on to it. So if you're singing Holy, 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 and the pastor says Holy, you're going to go, hey, I've heard that before. Yeah. And maybe just snag your attention for a couple seconds. And I don't think that's a bad thing. The second thing to what you were saying, an idea I was bouncing around when my kids were a little bit younger, was if the kid is capable of reciting the Lord's Prayer by memory, I would say that that was my goal for having my child sit through an entire service. So, I mean, of course, when our kid was 6 months old, did we utilize the nursery at our former church? Absolutely. And it made such a big difference in the way my wife and I could pay attention. Yeah. But at the same time, it meant that my son wasn't experiencing the service. But I thought, if my kid, and we pray with them before bedtime, and the Lord's Prayer is kind of in a standard rotation we do. If they can pray and memorize the Lord's Prayer, I thought that, I don't have any research to this one, but at least if they were capable of doing that, it might be an okay time to put them in the worship service and say, here we go. And you're going to drown a little bit, but that's okay for me. That's okay. We're gonna work on this together.
To try to, I don't know how much time you guys still have, but to try to wrap up semi-soon, I wanted to throw out this one question that was posted, which is kind of be more of a pro on keeping them separated. You wouldn't have a second grader sit in for a university course, would you? Basically saying that the message is over their head, that the preacher's speaking at some level higher than second grade level. Is that a reason? Let's give them a time and message that is for them. How would you respond to that?
They're right in the sense that no, I would not have. What was the age?
He said second grade. Sit in for a university course.
No, I wouldn't have a second grader sit in for a university course. I also wouldn't equate the worship service with a university course. That's where, unfortunately, the analogy falls apart a little bit. I know where he's going with it. He's trying to emphasize developmentally, and there's a conversation within youth ministry, both at the everyday professional and amongst youth ministry academics, kind of a back and forth argument about whether it's better to do age appropriate, age segregated ministry, or whether you go all in and do totally all intergenerational. And there's two extremes on that, and the bulk of us are in the middle saying both are actually necessary. That there is a place for developmentally appropriate teaching. So I'm a big fan of there being Sunday schools, a big fan of Vacation Bible School. I mean, obviously, I would hope I would be. I'm training people how to lead those. So I'm big supporter in that sense. But if you exclude that intergenerational component, I think you're also losing out on one, you're stretching the young person. The second grader can, again, I'm going to come back to this, the second grader is going to comprehend more than you're assuming. And let's say you even isolate the sermon and say the sermon is going to be well above the second grader's head. Yes. And the sermon should be well above the second grader's head. Otherwise, it's going to be intellectually insulting to the parents who are there and not going to feed them well from God's word. But that's okay. It's okay that the second grader is less attentive, or at that point is handed the coloring book and is doing something else, but they have still learned, I think, vastly more from the presence of being in the larger service, that they're participating in the singing of songs, the praying of prayers. They are hearing through confession and absolution, they're hearing their sins being forgiven. That's enriching for a 6-year-old. That's enriching for a 60-year-old to hear. That's a positive thing. Right. They're going to get plenty out of the readings. Is it going to be totally over their head? Well, parts of things are absolutely going to be over their head. But I struggle with the idea that because a portion of the service is going to be over their head, that you take them away. Now, does that mean, would I argue and say, if somebody says, I only bring my kids to worship and I don't have them involved in a Sunday school, or I don't do further Christian education, I have an equal concern there as well, because they do need that balance where they need something that is more age specific to them, to start unpacking these things so they can understand what's going on at a deeper level.
So it's not like, maybe that's really what you just said is what I think I would like for all the listeners to consider. I think we oftentimes do this dichotomy. Yeah. You have this, we're all together in a service, or we split them all up based on generational age, culture, whatever specifics. But we really need both.
A truly healthy approach to ministry is going to have both. It's going to have an interaction that's cross-generational. It's going to have an interaction that is age-specific.
Which takes time. It's being longer at church on Sunday. Sure. Which is one reason why I think we were putting it in the nursery, too, because our current situation, I work on Sundays.
Sure.
So it's harder to stay for Sunday school, to put her in there, and then keep her through the third service, to then get lunch before I have to get off to work. Which is something I want to move away from. So maybe my goal is like, when she gets to about 5, I hope to financially be at the point where I'm not working on Sunday, and then we can do both.
Which again doubles back to the reason why the church needs to not be judgmental for where various people are and saying, well, what's the deal? There's that Andy. I mean, he teaches at a Lutheran school, but what kind of an example is he for his kids? Well, there's a necessity to what you're doing.
Right.
You may have a larger goal and a greater end and something that you're hoping to accomplish. You're not there yet.
Yeah. And there's a whole lot we don't see, too.
Correct.
Like your whole book, Teaching the Faith at Home. Right? Like what's done at home as well.
Absolutely.
Has a huge component.
Oh, yeah. It's enormous.
Since I want to respect your time because I told you an hour and we're at least time-wise, because we started like way beyond what I told you, is there any point in your book that you want to particularly share that would relate to this topic, or any of the research, or any closing points that you just really want to share with the audience, listeners, before we close?
Yeah, the biggest thing, I mean, when I went in to do the research, what I was looking at is I was focusing on confirmation, and I was really wanting to come up with, is there some sort of a confirmation curriculum or some approach to teaching confirmation that's going to help keep kids connected to the church over a long term? And at least my research demonstrated that no, there isn't. That in fact, your kid's connection and your family's connection to the life of the congregation prior to confirmation is the single biggest predictor of their involvement afterward. And from a statistical standpoint, it's off the chart. The predictive ability, it's insane. It's the kind of a thing where it's like, I'm not a statistician. It didn't jump out at me. The chair of my doctoral dissertation, he pointed that one out because it was not what I was looking for. It is what it has done for me, however, has made me an enormous fan of children's ministry, an enormous fan of saying, how much can you have your kids be invested and involved? It's not the kind of a thing where, I as a parent, if my faith is valuable, I have to be comfortable or find a way to make myself comfortable in having faith conversations where I see the opportunities to do it, which means I have to be intentional. I recall a story one time. I had a youth ministry volunteer, Kathy, who we were working at a soup kitchen in Costa Mesa, and she came by one day when I go to volunteer with a high school youth group, and she goes, "Dave, I did one of those things you do," which always makes you nervous because I don't know where she's going with this thing. I said, "Kathy, what does that mean? What did you do?" She says, "Well, I made a connection between what we were learning in the sermon on Sunday and something that was happening in a conversation with my daughter on our drive from home from school." Okay, that's the rich stuff. Okay, I'm preparing. I work on preparing church workers who I think are going to have a great lasting impact. I mean, you guys are invested in Lutheran education because you want to have an impact on the students you teach. But here's the thing: none of us have an impact on those students any more than their parents do, not by a long shot. Yeah. So if we can walk as the church, we can walk alongside mom and dad and say, "I'm your backup. I got your back when you are asked the question that's too difficult, or you are questioning whether you're handling things properly or not, or whether you're just in doubt for how do I help my son or daughter understand who Jesus is and why is he important in my life." That's the greatest thing to be involved in. Yeah. The greatest thing to be able to answer those questions, dovetail back to kind of the apologetic emphasis of of the show here is, when things are, when those questions arise, I want to be able to walk with parents, right? And for them to be able to feel comfortable, and for parents, for you guys to be able to say, "Look, my kids are going to ask me stuff that I am not equipped to answer, but my pastor's ready for it."
Right. Good. Jonathan, anything else?
Yeah, the only note I had quickly back to the math class, the calculus thing, is that, in my opinion, a second grader in a calculus class is kind of like a guest in a church service. They don't go in with a lot of prior knowledge,
right?
And they really just need to hear, the basics. And the second grader is going to hear the basics in church. The guest ought to hear the basics in every single church service. Now, like you said, if it's dumbed down only ever for a second grader's capacity to learn, the adults are not getting the intellectual depth that they ought to. They're not getting the meat of the faith. But I think that's where the responsibility would lie specifically on the pastor.
Right.
Is the worship service is meant for all, and during the sermon specifically, teach it all.
Yeah.
You're not only going to teach the hypostatic union of Christ, but you're also not only going to teach, "Let the little children come to me." you're going to cover all of it,
Right.
and you're going to teach the law and gospel in its fullness. You're going to teach Christ in his fullness, and it's going to meet the needs of that second grader, that college student, that guest, or that 80-year-old who's been in the same Lutheran pew in the same Lutheran church their entire life. They all need to hear about Jesus, and that puts a lot of burden on the pastor, but it also tells you exactly what the pastor gets to preach week in and week out.
Right. Well, and the sermon is not intended. The sermon is not the same thing even as a college lecture.
No.
And really would be misses the mark if it is. You're
not all lectures are from a scriptural text.
Well, this is true too.
Not all sermons are either, sadly. But
well, that's a whole other. Again, is that where we
Another
say that's another episode?
Yep.
But if you can easily overshoot the high school educated adult and hit him with something that he's not prepared for in the same way you can do that with a child. And I'm not comparing the child to the high school, the high school educated. I mean, that's not. It's not a critique in that sense, but that's not. The sermon does need to be accessible to the person who, I'm going to bring my neighbor who has never been to church before, and I've talked to him about a few of the basics, and he's agreed to come to church, and he has no concept. So when you say hypostatic union, he goes, hypo what?
Yeah.
There needs to be an unpacking of that in such a way that he's going to get it just as much as the second grader is going to grapple and go, I don't even know what that word means.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, thank you. David, thank you. David's book is Teaching the Faith at Home. What does this mean? How is this done? His last name is spelled Rueter, if you're searching for that. So it's David Rueter, Teaching the Faith at Home. David did mention that this show has an apologetics angle. The intro I play says that Reconnect is dedicated to sharing and defending the good news of Jesus Christ. This show is certainly, I think, more focused on the sharing element. And I think this was a way that is sometimes overlooked. We think of sharing the gospel as evangelism, having to speak to non-believers. But we have children in our households, and we want to share the gospel with them, and they need to be a part of the body of Christ. And share in the body of Christ. And if they have faith, well, they have a spiritual gift for the church. There's a role for them for us to benefit from, and we all have something to offer when we gather, even the little children. So that's really what I wanted you to walk away with and remember, and to just kind of grapple with in your own life, in your own church setting. Do you have ways for children to interact with you in worship, with others your age in worship, with the elderly in worship? And how can they benefit from that? And are we doing a disservice if we don't have that? Stuff for you to think about, stuff for you to pray about. And in particular, I want to leave you with that gospel message, which is that Christ died for your sins, that he was buried, and that he rose according to the scriptures for our salvation. And it is that message that reconnects us into a right relationship with the Lord.
Hey, my name is Joel Esch. I'm the editor of Fishing for Leviathan, a weblog committed to the ongoing conversation between technology and theology. While I'm neither a full-blooded Luddite nor a Kool-Aid drinking technophile, I do have a substantial interest in the ways that digital texts and classic embodied theology work together, and sometimes fight to the teeth, continually shaping the culture around us. The website is www.fishingforleviathan.com. You can also track our Facebook page, which collates some of the more interesting articles on digital technology as intellectually satisfying content for your own conversations at home, school, and/or your parish. Our Facebook page is www.facebook.com/fishingforleviathan. Offer your own voice in this ongoing conversation. Be a part of a growing community that keeps its eyes up toward each other and not down toward a screen. We look forward to hearing from you at fishingforleviathan.com.
To financially support Reconnect, visit contradictmovement.org and order your copy of Contradict, They Can't All Be True. Contradict stickers and tracks are also available. Again, that's contradictmovement.org. Your mission, if you choose to accept it, share this episode on all of your social media sites and with your email contacts, people who will benefit from listening to the show. Thank you for listening. Reconnect us, O Lord.